Welcome everyone to the last lecture of POL 336, where we're going to learn a little bit about Syria. So just in terms of some background, and a lot of this information is also in our shared Google Sheet. So if you're curious about Syria's regime type today and other facts like its Human Development Index, you can obviously check there as well. But just in terms of some background, so Syria gained its independence from France in the mid 1940s. And Syria as a country is rather diverse when it comes to both ethnicity being like descent based characteristics, and religion. And so in Syria, these are the specific identities that are both socially and politically important for people. You have a Sunni Arab population that makes up the majority of the population in the country. You have Alawites, who are an ethnic group who are organized around their religion. So Alawites are sort of an offshoot of Shiite Islam. So they're kind of like Shia Muslims, but in a different kind of denomination or sect. Then you have a Christian population, a Kurdish population, and a Druze population. And so this map is just showing you the diversity in religions across Syria specifically, and then just to give you a little bit more context, comparing it to other countries that are in the MENA. And again, this is looking at not just the distribution of religions, but also geographically, where different populations live based on their identity. So Sunni Arabs live in this part of the country, right? You have the Alawite Arabs living here, a small population of Shiite Arabs, Sunni Kurds who live up here, and these are the areas that were important in the Syrian civil war, and then other populations that are relatively geographically concentrated. So what happened in Syria is you had a period of relative turmoil as the country became independent, and then you had a military coup, which essentially started the decades-long control of the Syrian government by the Alawites, and even more specifically than just the Alawites, by the Assad family. And so Hafez al-Assad came to power in 1970, and much like other Middle Eastern countries, really tried to reorganize the country around pan-Arabism. The Ba'ath Party was this pan-Arab, like socialist party that was going to try to focus on development through more governmental involvement. And this was something that was mentioned in the Kamet reading from like several weeks ago earlier in this semester. But what ended up happening is that the Sunni Arab population, which makes up the majority of the country, not all of it obviously, but like 65%, was marginalized. But Hafez al-Assad was pretty adept at being able to co-opt a lot of different actors in Syria. And so by co-optation, what we mean by that is essentially being able to buy them in some way to get their support. So whether that's with political positions, whether that's with actual like goods or money, but he was very skilled in being able to manage a lot of these different groups that could potentially have worked together to overthrow his dominance. But they did not, because he was able to really co-opt all of them into the regime, so that everyone had some sort of personal, economic, business, political interest in seeing the al-Assad regime continue. And so what happened is his son took over the presidency in 2000. Now, Bashar's older brother was originally being sort of prepared to take over the presidency. And again, by presidency here, we're obviously not talking about a democracy where presidents are elected through free and fair elections. We're talking about a presidency where, this is an executive that has the appearance of being a president, but for all intents and purposes, they're a dictator, right? Because it's not a democracy, it's a dictatorship. So his older brother was supposed to take over, but then his older brother was killed in a car crash, and Bashar al-Assad was actually abroad, I believe in England, studying to be an eye doctor. He came back, he took over the presidency, and as was described in the Wendy Perlman book, as well, there was this initial period of like the Damascus Spring where it seemed with this new leader who had not been involved too much in the running of Syria before. Maybe he was going to economically liberalize the country and also politically liberalize the country, but that ended up not being the case at all. And so fast forward a number of years, and this is also something that's described in the Wendy Perlman book, that after that Damascus Spring, all of the sort of like social contracts or the sort of like deals that had been in place for people like, hey, you don't have any political rights, but look, you're gonna, the government's gonna provide jobs, and you're gonna have, we're gonna provide you with all of these economic benefits and take care of you, so you don't need any political rights, like you'll be fine. All of that really fell to the wayside when Bashar took over, and there ended up being quite a lot of economic grievances that people had. Like life in Syria was just not going well at all. And so Syria's experience with the Arab Spring was such that as was seen in Egypt and Tunisia, there were big protests, and they were peaceful, right? They were peaceful protests. So what happened specifically in the Dara region is that a couple of kids had spray painted, some kind of anti-Bashar al-Assad graffiti. And those kids ended up getting detained by the Syrian security forces and were tortured. And one of them was killed, 13-year-olds. And so people came out to protest the way that the government had responded. And so this ended up getting like bigger. The government offered some concessions, but the protests continued because the real demands were not being met. And what happened in response is that more and more people started to protest, and the government started to kill protesters, which led to more protests at funerals of protesters. And so this really big mass mobilization happened in Syria. And because of the brutal response of the regime, some people within that originally nonviolent protest movement decided that it was not enough to just go out into the streets because people were getting killed. So they had to take up arms. So there were some non-Alawites, some Sunnis who had been in the military who defected and formed the Free Syrian Army. And then again, this like huge cycle of escalatory protests, the government killing the protesters, more protests. It really just devolved into a civil war. And so by like 2012, there was enough fighting for it to reach the threshold of being considered a civil war, which maybe this seems a little bit arbitrary, but generally we call civil wars conflicts in which the government is like on one side, and then you have non-state actors on the other. So Syria obviously meets that criteria. And then you also have to have 1,000 battle deaths a year. So like if you have 999, are you probably a civil war? Yeah, probably. But it's also in the midst of a civil war, especially one that's like just starting. It's really hard to know what is going on. So we use like the best estimate of 1,000 to basically signify we're like now in the realm of a major armed conflict that's happening in a country. And so you can click on these links to get more information about like the timeline of the conflict. right? There were lots of attempts to resolve it. There were lots of ceasefires, but there was no genuine political resolution for a few reasons. One has to do with the fact that on the opposition side, and here's a link to an article from the Washington Post if you wanted to just read like a synopsis of political science empirical research about this. But one of the things we know from a lot of studies about civil war is when you have like the rebels and you have lots and lots of rebel organizations and they're not really coordinated and it's not really clear who's in charge and they're not kind of checking each other's actions, it's really difficult to reach a negotiated solution because like who is the government going to negotiate with? If they negotiate with like the Free Syrian Army, does the Free Syrian Army have control over what ISIS is doing? Because ISIS ended up coming into Syria in the midst of a civil war. So much like the Israeli government's position is that, well, we don't know who to negotiate with because there's Fatah and there's Hamas, and so like we have two different actors, right? And so that is partially by design with the Israeli government, but in general, when you have lots of opposition actors, certainly more than two, it's just by design going to be a lot harder to reach any kind of a negotiated settlement. And so what also ended up happening in Syria was not just like a civil war, but it became an internationalized civil war. So one of the things that we know, especially after like 2014, when Russia came to the assistance of the Assad regime, which really tipped the scales of the war completely into like the Assad government's favor. It had been the case that like the rebels were gaining ground and controlled territory, and that maybe the civil war was kind of going in their direction. But Russia coming in, offering a lot of air support to the Syrian government, completely changed the balance of the war back to the favor of the government. And one of the other things that we know from the Civil War literature, so if you're interested, there is a peace and conflict class that I teach that goes over a whole bunch of things related to Civil War, this included. One of the things we know is that when outside actors get involved, especially states, like civil wars last a lot longer because it enables actors to keep fighting when they probably would have reached some sort of stalemate that would require them to do something other than keep fighting. And so Syria just became a giant mess. You had Russia supporting the Assad government. Then you had anti-Assad external actors like the Gulf states. The U.S. initially was anti-Assad. You also had a coalition. So like Russia initially was supporting the Assad government and the U.S. was supporting the rebels. But then Russia and the U.S. started working together to fight ISIS, because ISIS had come into Syria, and ISIS had originally been called Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It ended up being essentially decimated after the Sunni uprising and the surge during the second Obama administration that completely decimated Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But Al-Qaeda in Iraq ended up rebranding itself. It kind of split from Al-Qaeda because it thought that Al-Qaeda was actually not extreme enough. And so it rebranded itself as ISIS and moved into Syria in the midst of the civil war and took advantage of the fact that there was essentially this no person's land, complete loss of state sovereignty over parts of it, to basically rebuild. And then it was able to go back into Iraq and took over Iraq's second biggest city, Mosul. And so all of that was happening, right? And at the same time, the Kurds, an ethnic group in Syria, were working with the U.S. government to fight ISIS, but Turkey did not want to work with the Kurds because Turkey has a Kurdish population that has been advocating for secession. There's an organization called the PKK in Turkey who had launched a whole huge wave of terrorist attacks. And so Turkey did not like the Kurds who were helping the U.S. And it was just a giant mess. right? If you want to learn a little bit more about the Syrian uprising or revolution, there's this video from 2017 from Vox and then also from CNN that talks about the peace attempts that were being made in 2017. And so this is from the Institute for the Study of War, and this is an organization that really tracks like who controls which territory, not just for Syria, but they also have similar maps for the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. I am guessing, although I have not checked, but I'm guessing that they may have similar maps for what is happening in Iran, although technically there are no ground forces, U.S. ground forces in Iran, so they may not have maps on that. But this just basically shows, like, in 2017, who was controlling what, right? This is not a country where there was any kind of internal sovereignty by the government. So the Syrian government forces controlled this area, right? ISIS controlled this area. Then you had the Kurds in the yellow. You had Turkish-backed forces, just like a whole hodgepodge of control. And these are similar maps. This is at the end of 2022 and the beginning of 2023. So you can kind of see the difference in where those like lines of control had ended up. And this is from March of 2023, just to show again, like the Syrian government regained control of a large part of the territory, but this is an area that was controlled by the Kurds, right? And these were Turkish and Turkish-aligned Syrian rebel forces, and you had rebels here too. So there were still parts of Syria, even in 2020-23, that were not controlled by the government. So the other absolutely devastating thing about the Syrian civil war is that it completely destroyed the country. These are just some images that I found online of like before and after photos, just so you can see like the extent of the devastation. I mean, a civil war that lasts for so long, you can imagine, has just completely destroyed a large swath of the infrastructure of the country. Again, you could see some of these really, like really troubling images to think that people were living through this. As I know that you read about or have been reading about in the Wendy Perlman book. And so if you're curious, there's a really great website that I have linked to. There's an article here, and then I think I have it in the next slide, that basically collects information about different like ceasefires that have happened in armed conflicts. And so there were, from 2012 to 2020, there were 142 ceasefires. And this is that article again, right, that most of them in the early phase involved the UN, but then after Russia got involved, and I should have mentioned too, like Iran also got involved. Iran was also supporting the Assad government, and then Turkey got involved, kind of anti-Kurds, but supporting the rebels who were fighting against the Assad government as well. There were several, not too many actually, Security Council resolutions about Syria, and I will say not too many because Russia, being on the Security Council, is one of the 5 permanent members that has veto power. So a lot of resolutions that other countries that are on the Security Council attempted to bring up to try to resolve like the political grievances underlying the Syrian civil war were vetoed by Russia, and so a lot of them never came to fruition. This just talks about the peace process, right? And there were several attempts made to try to resolve it. And really, this is a really great website too, called peaceagreements.org, where you can like visualize the peace process and what types of ceasefires were made. So if you're interested, you could check out these links to help you understand how things went. obviously enormous humanitarian devastation and crisis in Syria, as I think was reflected in pretty much every single story of the Wendy Perlman book that talked about Syria post-Arab Spring. Here's a video if you'd like to watch it. These are all of the refugees, like the Syrian refugees. I know that there's been a lot of reports or a lot of like media coverage about Syrian refugees in Europe and how that impacted Germany and then how that impacted other countries in Europe and it for sure led to a huge anti-immigrant backlash across European countries. But just to be clear, most of the Syrian immigrants did not go to Europe. Most of them went to neighboring states, which would make sense because obviously if you're a refugee who's fleeing your home in the midst of a civil war, it's really hard to get to Europe. It's a lot easier to just cross a border into a neighboring state. And then the US and the EU also responded by sanctioning the Syrian government. And actually, I think this was in 2025, the Trump administration decided to remove sanctions on the new Syrian government because Bashar al-Assad fled, which I'll get to in just a moment, fled to Russia, to Moscow, I believe, after the remaining rebel forces ended up essentially like storming through the country and got to the capital, and then he just left. But so those sanctions, I believe, have been removed now, but they were in place throughout the entire duration of the conflict. And then in the mid-2000s, like 2020s or like early 2020s, when it became clear, and especially after like after Russia and Iran intervened to like really support the Assad government, a lot of the Arab countries in the Middle East that had initially broken ties with the Syrian government ended up reinstating them. And so what happened, and this was crazy, I remember reading about Assad fleeing, and it was shocking, but also so exciting for Syria. So on December 8th, in just 2024, armed forces had basically taken over the capital of Damascus, and Bashar al-Assad left a bunch of people, just took his family, booked it, and went to Moscow. And it was just nuts. After decades of being ruled by the Assad family, they were gone, right? There had been reports, so like late November of 2024, very early December, there had been reports in major newspapers that cover international news about rebels kind of moving from that rebel-held area in Syria, moving down to other parts of like the country, and basically just like Syrian military forces like fled. They were severely underpaid. Morale was super low. Like they were just not vested in continuing with the regime because they did not feel like the regime was taking care of them. And so they ended up fleeing. And so what happened is, if we fast forward to today, or at least to March 4th of 2026, here's a video that you can watch about where Syria stands today. So the rebel leader ended up sort of reconstituting himself as the leader of Syria. Syria has said that it does not want to get involved in the U.S.-Israel attack in Iran, but we have not seen like free and fair elections happen in Syria since the new government came to power, although they have been trying to reach out to, say, like the US and countries in Europe to try to demonstrate that they're committed to instituting some sort of democracy and protecting minorities, since Syria is a country that has minorities. And so what will happen remains to be seen. But it was extremely shocking that after decades of rule by the Assad family, they're just gone, right? So hopefully we got some massive reconstruction happening in Syria. hopefully you get the start of a new fledgling democracy. And all of those Syrians who devastatingly lived through the civil war, hopefully they will be able to rebuild their country. So we'll just have to wait and see.